They laughed when I arrived in an Uber, smirked at my thrift store blouse. One cousin whispered, "Still broke, huh?" And they all chuckled like I wasn't even there. But then my father's eyes locked on my wrist. "Is that Reads number 3," he asked, voice cracking. Forks froze mid-air. In a room full of polished wealth, it was that quiet relic on my arm that shattered every assumption. They thought I'd failed until one watch revealed a legacy they never saw coming. Let me tell you how one dinner changed everything they thought they knew about me and everything I thought I knew about them. The Morgan estate hadn't changed. The wrought iron gates still loomed like sentinels, and the driveway curved around the marble fountain that had once seemed enchanted to a much younger me. Now it just looked excessive. The Uber driver whistled low as we pulled up. "Nice place," he said. I nodded, already dreading the evening ahead. As I stepped out, a valet rushed over, clearly unsure what to do with a mid-range hybrid. I handed him the keys with a polite smile, acutely aware of the gleaming Bentleys and Porsches already lined up. I adjusted my coat, brushed invisible lint from my sleeve, and climbed the front steps alone. The butler Philip, who had served this house since I was a child, opened the door. "Miss Elena," he said, a bit too surprised. "Welcome back." "Thank you, Philip," I replied, gently. "It's good to see you." Inside, everything was just as I remembered: marble floors, oil paintings of dead Morgans, and the faint scent of lilies mixed with old money. The chatter from the great room floated toward me, laughter, clinking glasses, someone bragging about closing a deal in Singapore. "Elena," a voice called, too bright to be warm. My mother, Veronica Morgan, emerged perfectly styled in navy silk and pearls, her expression unreadable. She walked over, leaned in, and offered a brief kiss in the air beside each cheek. "You didn't wear the dress I sent," she observed. "I like this one," I said, adjusting the simple blouse I'd picked for comfort. "It's very you," she murmured, clearly disappointed. "Come, your father's by the fireplace." I followed her through the room, feeling a dozen eyes glance over me, assessing. The Morgans were masters of subtle judgment, no outright insults, just raised brows, long pauses, and backhanded compliments sharp enough to cut. "Elena," my father said, standing. He gave me a firm handshake instead of a hug. His tone was cordial, like I was a distant business contact. "Glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," I lied. Then came Julian. "Elena," he drawled, sipping from a crystal tumbler. "Still fighting the good fight in tech for good, or have you finally joined the grown-ups?" "Still fighting," I replied, with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. He chuckled. "Admirable. Someone's got to save the world while the rest of us pay the taxes." Everyone laughed. It wasn't particularly funny, but that wasn't the point. The point was that Julian had spoken, and his voice shaped the room. I stood in silence, surrounded by people who shared my blood, but none of my convictions. Conversations swirled around business acquisitions, luxury renovations, and which private school had the better Mandarin immersion program. No one asked about my work or how I'd been. No one cared. My mother steered me toward the bar. "Have a drink, darling. You look tired." Tired was code for underwhelming. I declined the champagne flute she offered and picked up a glass of water instead. She sighed, just loud enough. Across the room, Julian was already holding court. "We're expanding into Dubai next quarter," he said. "They're hungry for high-rise residential. The numbers are absurd. Julian's the visionary of the family," someone said. My mother beamed. I drifted toward a window, seeking a moment of quiet, my reflection barely visible against the backdrop of perfectly manicured gardens. I used to love this house. Now it felt like walking through a museum curated by people who'd archived my relevance. I had built something that mattered, something real, but here it was invisible. Behind me, Julian's voice carried again. "Let's hope Elena's latest venture doesn't end like her last one." Another round of polite chuckles. My spine stiffened. I said nothing, not yet. I wasn't here to win tonight. I was here because family, no matter how flawed, deserved the effort, or so I kept telling myself. I looked down at my wrist, at the old understated watch, a quiet reminder of someone who had seen my worth when no one else did, and that reminder was about to change everything. As dinner was announced and guests began filtering into the dining room, I moved slowly, not because of the heels, those were low and sensible, but because of the weight of old wounds pressing against the present. The long mahogany table stretched like a runway of legacy and exclusion, each name card precisely placed. I wasn't surprised to see mine positioned at the far end away from my parents, beside a second cousin I barely knew. I took my seat quietly, letting the hum of cutlery and conversation fill the silence I carried with me. As the servers poured wine, my mind drifted back to the moment everything had changed. I was 27, freshly graduated from MIT with honours, and I'd just turned down an offer to join Morgan Enterprises. I remember the way the boardroom fell silent when I said thank you, but I believe my work is elsewhere. My father didn't speak, not then, but his silence was deafening. Julian smirked. "She wants to save the world," he said, leaning back. Cute. A week later, I received formal notice that my access to the Morgan Trust was being postponed indefinitely pending review. No discussion, no explanation, just exile. I'd tried calling my mother voicemail. I emailed my aunt, my godfather, even my childhood piano teacher who now worked in the family office. No one responded. It wasn't until a year later, during a random coffee with an old cousin, that the truth emerged. Julian had gone to each of them, painting me as unstable, erratic, someone who was rejecting her family out of pride or delusion. He'd said I was a risk, that aligning with me could endanger their place in the Morgan hierarchy. And they believed him. Or worse, they didn't care enough to question it. That was the moment I stopped trying to explain myself. Back at the table, the first course arrived, seared scallops over parsnip puree plated like art. I pushed the food around gently, appetite dulled by the memories swirling like ghosts. Julian raised his glass. "To legacy," he declared. "To those who understand what it takes to carry a name forward." There were murmurs of agreement, a few clinks of crystal. No one looked at me. Legacy. That word had been weaponized in this family, not as a torch to be passed, but as a leash. I'd refused to be tethered to buildings and profit margins when I knew I could build something else, something that didn't just make money, but made meaning. I looked around the table at the people who had once called me brilliant, who'd toasted my early scholarships and science fair trophies. Now they acted as though I were a stranger with a tarnished surname. And yet beneath the table I ran my thumb over the edge of the watch's leather strap, grounding myself. I didn't come tonight to fit in. I came to remember why I no longer needed to. Julian caught my eye across the table, held it for a beat, then offered a condescending smile. He knew what this room did to me. But this time it would be different. This time I wasn't just the outcast, I was the storm, and no one saw it coming. Before Nova Bridge ever had an office, before the name meant anything to anyone, there was just a whiteboard in a co-working space and an idea I couldn't let go of. An idea about using machine learning not for profit margins, but for progress, equity, access solutions where bureaucracy had failed. That was when I met Malcolm Reed. It was at a small, underfunded data science summit in Boston, more folding chairs than velvet curtains. I was there with a poster board and a demo that kept crashing. I had no sponsors, no reputation, and the tech media barely looked my way. Dr. Reed was a keynote speaker that year, though no one expected him to actually attend anything outside his panel. He was notoriously elusive former tenured professor-founder of 2 unicorn companies turned semi-reclusive after selling his second startup and donating half his wealth to educational reform. But somehow he ended up standing in front of my booth. I didn't recognize him at first. He wore the same faded flannel I'd seen in old Wired articles, and his badge just said Malcolm. I thought he was another burnt-out developer wandering between panels. He stared at my code, then at the map visualization on the screen. "You're correlating absenteeism with zip code infrastructure data," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, trying to predict dropout risk in underserved districts before it spikes. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he smiled. "Everyone here is trying to make people buy faster. You're trying to make people stay." He stayed at my table for nearly an hour, asking questions that didn't feel like tests, but like doors opening. When he finally left, he handed me a small card with just his initials and a phone number. "Call me when you're ready to scale this," he said. It wasn't until that night, Googling in my rented room, that I realized who he really was. The next week I called him. The first time we met properly, it was in a library, not a corporate boardroom. He refused to meet in glass towers. "Good ideas don't grow under fluorescent light," he said. Over old books and black coffee, he told me about the early days of his first company, how he'd been obsessed with building something elegant and useful, then watched it get twisted by investors who only cared about speed and exits. "I lost control," he said simply. "Built a monster dressed in mission statements. That's why he walked away. That's why he invested in people now, not pitches. You don't dress like you're performing," he told me once. "And your code doesn't either. That's rare." That compliment stayed with me longer than any award. A few months into our mentorship, I finally asked about the story I'd heard in passing, that he'd once nearly collaborated with Morgan Enterprises. He laughed short and bitter. "It wasn't with your father," he said. "It was Julian." My stomach tightened. He approached me when he was fresh out of business school, wanted to modernize one of my educational models, said all the right words. But the moment we sat down with his legal team, they were carving up the IP like vultures. He pulled back his sleeve slightly, revealing a long, pale scar down his wrist. They weren't interested in equity, just ownership. He walked away from the deal. Julian had painted it as a flaky tech guy afraid of scale. I remembered that Reed said, "When I saw your last name, I almost didn't stay at your booth." I looked at him, my face burning. "But you did." He smiled again, gentler this time. "Because you didn't sound like them. And more importantly, you didn't act like you had anything to prove." That was the moment everything shifted. He wasn't just a mentor after that. He was the first person who believed in my work without needing a pitch deck. The first who didn't ask me how I planned to monetize. The first who saw through the surname and into the core. "You're not trying to impress the room," he told me once, "you're trying to fix it." And that's why he stayed. The last time I saw Malcolm Reed alive was on my 37th birthday. We met as always in his small study in upstate New York. It was a modest cabin nestled between trees and fog, where he said the Wi-Fi was just slow enough to keep him honest. The place smelled of cedar ink and thyme. He had insisted on cooking. The meal was simple rosemary potatoes and grilled vegetables plated like it was Michelin-starred. He poured 2 glasses of wine and raised his in a quiet toast. "To being unbuyable," he said with a crooked grin. We talked for hours. About the students using NovaBridge to build their own futures, about my latest headache with a procurement system that wanted to shove my platform into a compliance box it was never meant for. At some point, our laughter slowed. He grew quieter, more introspective. His hand trembled slightly as he refilled his glass. I hadn't seen that before. "I've been thinking about the weight we carry," he said, staring into the fireplace. "The things we wear that no one sees." Then he stood and shuffled to a drawer. From it, he pulled out a small wooden box. He opened it slowly and placed it in front of me. Inside was a watch, sleek, understated, the kind of beauty that whispered instead of shouted. The dial was a rich, matte black, the hands thin and precise, the strap worn but strong. There was no branding, no logo. "This was the 3rd I ever made," he said, "back before the IPOs, when I still believed elegance was the answer." He lifted it gently like it might bruise under pressure, every gear, every tooth hand-filed. I made it in the quiet when I needed reminding of control. It's been with me ever since. I didn't know what to say. He extended it toward me. "Now it's yours, Malcolm," I said, shaking my head. I can't, this belongs in a museum. He chuckled. Museums are where we put things to be forgotten politely. He leaned closer. Wear it, Elena. And when they look at you and only see what you're not, let this remind you of everything you are. Don't let people who can't see your worth make you question it. My hands trembled as I took it, not from the weight of the object, but from what it meant. He placed a hand over mine. You were never the shadow of your family. You're the fire they ignored. I swallowed hard. Thank you, I whispered. He nodded once, and for the first time in years I saw something flicker in his expression, grief. There's something you should know, he said after a long pause. I used to be friends with your father. I blinked. What? We met when we were both nobodies, shared coffee in bad diners. He had ambition, I had blueprints. It could have been something. What happened, Julian? He said simply. Even as a boy, that one knew how to make people pick sides. He told me how Julian had intercepted their early collaborations, manipulated conversations, planted doubts. Claimed Reed was unreliable, egotistical, too academic for real business. Your father believed him. He said not bitterly, just factually. And that was that. My throat tightened. All these years I thought my connection to Reed was random lucky. I didn't realise it had once been legacy interrupted. He never told me, I whispered. He probably doesn't remember Reed said, but I do. I looked down at the watch again. It gleamed quietly in the firelight, a symbol of everything my family tried to forget and everything I chose to build anyway. He died 3 weeks later. A heart attack, they said. Quick, painless. But the absence was seismic. The watch became my compass, not because of its value, but because of the values it carried, because Malcolm Reed had given it to me, not as a reward, but as a reminder. And now on my wrist it beat silently against my skin like a second heart ticking the rhythm of everything he taught me. The dining room was a cathedral of opulence, tall windows framed by gold-draped curtains, chandeliers glittering like frozen fireworks overhead, and a mahogany table set with china that hadn't seen daylight since the last Morgan Gala. 22 name cards, 22 forks lifted in synchronized grace, and me the 23rd, the outlier. I had barely settled into my seat when Julian struck. So, Eleanor, he said, leaning back with a smirk that could cut glass, what are you doing with all your free time these days? Still exploring alternative career paths? There it was, the opening jab. The hush that followed wasn't silence, it was anticipation. The table leaned in like spectators at a blood sport. I've been working, I said evenly. Our team just wrapped a project with the education department in he interrupted, slicing into his lamb, still fighting the good fight. That's admirable. Sort of like volunteering, isn't it? A few cousins chuckled. My Aunt Pamela sipped her wine with a smirk. I glanced at my mother, hoping naively that she might intervene. Her eyes were fixed on her plate. She dabbed her lips with a napkin, composed as ever. Eleanor's always had a passion for underdogs, Julian continued. Remember when she tried to digitize the food bank in college? What was that line you said back then, Lena? Innovation meets compassion. You should trademark it. Laughter rippled across the table. I smiled politely, heart thudding. Actually, that system's still running. They serve 30,000 families a month. Julian raised an eyebrow. That many? Impressive. Though I'm guessing they're not exactly paying top dollar. Another round of laughter, this time sharper. I forced a breath, measuring my voice. Sometimes value isn't measured in margins, Julian. Spoken like someone who's never had to answer to shareholders, he replied smoothly, lifting his glass. But hey, cheers to doing good. I reached for my water hands, steady though my gut clenched. It wasn't the words that hurt, it was the ease, the practiced rhythm of degradation masked as wit. I had danced this dance too many times. You know, chimed in Aunt Cynthia, adjusting her diamond necklace. I read somewhere that non-profits are often a front for idealists who couldn't make it in the real market. Of course, that doesn't apply to you, dear. The backhand landed. I glanced at my mother again. Still nothing. She's always marched to her own drum, my uncle added. Even as a kid, she was the one playing outside while the rest of us learned Excel. It's brave, my cousin Emily said with a grin. Choosing principle over paychecks. Not everyone could live like that. The room nodded in agreement. As if poverty were a costume I'd put on for effect. As if simplicity were synonymous with failure. My fork hovered over my plate. The scallops were perfect. I couldn't taste them. Didn't you once live in a studio apartment in Queens? Someone asked. I still do, I replied. Gasps were subtle but audible. A Morgan in Queens. I hope it's at least a doorman building, Aunt Pamela said. I smiled. It's walk up. 5th floor. Julian shook his head, mock pity in his voice. Elena, you know we'd help if you ever needed. I'm fine. I cut in sharper than I intended. He raised both hands. Of course. Just saying there's no shame in asking for support. Family should be a net, not a wall. A net that only caught the ones who played by their rules. I bit back every retort. Let the silence answer for me. Across the table, someone tapped a crystal with a spoon. To the Morgans, they toasted. To resilience, tradition, and knowing who we are. The glasses rose. I didn't lift mine, because I knew exactly who I was. And tonight, so would they. Dessert arrived, a delicate tower of something French and fragile, cradled in gold-trimmed porcelain. Around me, conversation buzzed like white noise, a crescendo of shallow victories and curated accomplishments. Then came Melissa. She was the youngest of our generation, 28, immaculately filtered, more influencer than individual. Her voice lilted across the table like perfume. You know, she said eyes on me, but talking to everyone, real success doesn't hide. I blinked, caught mid-sip. She leaned forward, manicured fingers resting lightly on her champagne flute. If I built something truly impressive, I'd want the world to know. Wouldn't you? A few others nodded, murmuring in agreement. Melissa smiled, but there was steel in her teeth. It's almost suspicious, isn't it? How little we know about what exactly Elena does. I help students and non-profits, I said simply. But how she pressed. What exactly does your company do? Where's your office? Who funds you? You never talk about metrics, scale, reach. I do talk, I said evenly. Just not here. Because here the only metric that matters is flash. She tilted her head. And what's wrong with a little flash? Isn't visibility part of impact? My mother chose that moment to finally speak. Melissa has a point. Legacy requires presence. Silence can be confusing. My father remained quiet, swirling the last of his wine. I set my fork down, appetite long gone. I didn't come here to defend my resume, I said. I came to honour this family, even when it doesn't honour me. Julian snorted. You make it sound like we've exiled you. You have, I said calmly. The room quieted, just for a breath. That's unfair, my aunt began. No, I said. It's precise. I stood slowly, the scrape of my chair on the marble floor louder than I intended. Excuse me. I turned toward the door. I wasn't going to cry, not here, not now. Elena. My father's voice stopped me. I paused, half-turned. He was staring at my wrist. Is that... He began standing. His voice had shifted, no longer tired or detached. It carried weight now. History. I followed his gaze to the watch partially visible beneath my sleeve. He walked toward me, steps slow but sure. The room watched in stunned silence. He stopped in front of me, eyes locked on the timepiece. That's Reed's design, he said quietly. The 3rd prototype. I remember the sketches, the movement's signature. Only 5 were ever completed. My mother's brows furrowed. Reed. As in Malcolm Reed. My father looked up, something new in his face. Recognition, reverence, maybe regret. Where did you get this? He asked. I held his gaze. He gave it to me. Dead silence. You knew him? He asked. I worked with him. He was my mentor. Julian's glass clinked softly against the table. Wait, what? My father's voice was softer, now reverent. This watch, it's worth a fortune. But it's more than that. It's one of the last things he made by hand. I nodded. He gave it to me on my birthday, said it belonged with someone who valued precision over pretense. The room shifted, its temperature, its tone. Something ancient and heavy stirred in the collective awareness. Julian's face twisted slightly. That's not possible. Reed cut ties with the family years ago. I met his eyes. Because of you. Another ripple of silence. I turned to my father. He told me what happened, how you used to be friends, how Julian broke that. My father blinked. The truth settled like dust over old wounds. Melissa's voice, suddenly thin, tried to recover. Still, I mean, it's just a watch, right? No, my father said, his voice now commanding the room. It's not just a watch. He looked at me differently now, as if seeing a version of me for the first time, one that didn't need his name to mean something. Elena, he said softly, what exactly have you built? I took a breath, the kind that reaches back through years of silence and sacrifice. And for the first time I was ready to answer. My father's fingers hovered near my wrist, reverent but hesitant, like he was reaching for something sacred. You're telling me Malcolm Reed gave you this? Yes, I said. Personally. It was the last piece he ever made by hand. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was seismic. Conversations screeched to a halt. Wine glasses remained mid-air. Someone's fork dropped with a soft clink against porcelain, and no one even turned to see whose. My mother broke the stillness. Darling, you never mentioned you knew. Malcolm. I didn't think it would matter, I said, eyes never leaving my father's, not to this table. His gaze stayed rooted on the watch. Reed and I, years ago, before Julian even graduated, we talked about creating something together. He had ideas for data models that could revolutionize civic infrastructure. We were aligned. His voice dipped more to himself than to the room. He promised I'd receive one of his prototypes. Said he'd reserve one just for me. Julian stiffened. But I never heard from him again, my father finished. Now all eyes turned to Julian. He shifted in his seat, the corners of his mouth tightening. That was decades ago. Things changed. People grow apart. My father's eyes narrowed slightly. Did you ever speak to him? Julian? Julian gave a light, practiced shrug. I may have tried to connect once or twice when I joined the firm. It didn't lead anywhere. I assumed he'd moved on. I watched the micro-expressions flicker across my father's face, doubt, confusion, then something older, betrayal. Funny, I said softly. Because Malcolm told me he walked away after your meetings. Said the moment he saw the Morgan logo on a term sheet, he knew something was rotten. Julian's jaw tightened. He said you came with lawyers, not ideas, that you treated his life's work like something to acquire and flip, that you made it clear you weren't interested in collaboration, just control. Julian looked to my mother, but she was too still. That's ancient history, he muttered, and completely subjective. My father turned from him back to me, his face unreadable, and yet he gave it to you. I nodded, because I listened. I didn't try to own him, I just learned from him. He studied me, not with suspicion, but with the kind of intensity that comes when something buried for too long is suddenly unearthed. Did you know, he said after a pause, he was the one who convinced me to invest in urban school renewal programs in the early 90s? I blinked. No. He told me, your buildings will crumble someday. Make sure your impact doesn't. I forgot that until now. His voice cracked on the last word. Around us, the table remained frozen. This was no longer a dinner. It was a reckoning. Julian cleared his throat, a dry, defensive sound. We're really turning this into a eulogy over a vintage watch. My father snapped his head toward him. You knew how much that prototype meant to me. You knew. And what would you have done with it, Julian said, pushing his chair back slightly. Put it in a vault. Hang it behind glass. At least now it's being used.
That's the point, I said. He didn't want it locked away. He gave it to someone who'd wear it, who'd remember what it meant. My voice dropped. And that's exactly why you never received it. Julian's eyes narrowed. And you think that makes you better than this family? No, I said. I think it means someone I admired saw something in me that this family never did. My father flinched but didn't disagree. He looked down at the watch once more, then back up, a strange mix of sadness and awe in his eyes. He always said legacy wasn't what you leave behind, it's what you pass on while you're still here. And for the first time in a room where I'd always been invisible, I felt seen. The silence that had blanketed the room now buzzed with something electric, shifting weight, uncertain footing. I could feel it in the air like the moment before a storm breaks. My father's straightened eyes never leaving my wrist. Do you have any idea what this is worth? I hesitated, then nodded. Malcolm told me. Not the exact figure, but he hinted. He exhaled slowly. That prototype was appraised at over $2 million 10 years ago. God knows what it would go for now, especially after his passing. A few gasps broke through the hush. My aunt's wineglass wobbled against the rim of her plate. Melissa visibly swallowed. Julian shifted in his seat, his confidence eroding with every passing second. It's insured, I added calmly, but not because of the price tag. My father tilted his head. Then why wear something so rare, so irreplaceable? I met his gaze. Because that's what Malcolm wanted. He believed beautiful things should be lived in, not locked away. Legacy isn't for shelves, it's for people. For a moment, no one responded. Then softly from my mother. But surely it would be safer somewhere else. I turned to her. Safety was never the point. Meaning was. She blinked, unsure how to respond. The energy in the room began to shift. It was subtle at first, a cousin leaning forward, an aunt, now nodding thoughtfully. I watched the familiar choreography of judgment start to falter. You've been wearing it all this time, asked Emily, her tone no longer mocking, but curious. Every day, I said. Through every client pitch, every product launch, every long night, I questioned if this path was worth it. And no one noticed someone muttered near the end of the table. Exactly. I wasn't trying to hide, I said. I just didn't need to prove anything. My father studied me again. He gave it to you because he trusted you with more than an object. He gave it to me, I said, my voice steady, because he saw that I wouldn't measure its value in headlines or auction houses. A long silence. Then Aunt Cynthia, who once dismissed my entire career as a noble little hobby, cleared her throat. You know, I always admired Malcolm. He had integrity. The words sounded foreign in her mouth, but I appreciated the effort. I remember when Forbes ran that piece about his refusal to sell to defence contractors, someone else added, cost him billions, made him a legend, another agreed. Julian leaned back, arms crossed, clearly displeased at the way the current was turning. But it was my father who shifted the most. I think he said, voice slow and deliberate, we've underestimated what you've been building. All heads turned. He looked around the table. We talk about legacy like it's something inherited. But maybe it's something earned. My mother touched his arm lightly. Thomas? But he shook his head firm now. No. She deserves more than our silence. He turned back to me. Eleanor, I should have asked sooner. But I'm asking now, what have you built? I could feel the lump in my throat, the heat rising behind my eyes, but I held steady. You'll see, I said. But not because I want to impress anyone, only because finally someone asked without judgment. The room sat in that moment heavy, quiet, reverent. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't the ghost at the Morgan table. I was the centre. Not because of my wealth, not because of a watch, but because at last they were beginning to see the woman they'd chosen not to know. My father's question hung in the air like an overdue thunderclap. What have you built? I inhaled, steadying my voice. It's called Nova Bridge. We create AI-powered platforms for underfunded schools and learning centres. We partner with educators to personalise curriculum, track student engagement in real time, and flag early signs of dropout risk. A pause. We currently serve over 12,000 students across 48 districts in the US and Southeast Asia. 3 national education ministries have adopted our platform. 2 UN programs use it in their refugee learning camps. Across the table, jaws didn't so much drop as quietly unlock. We're in beta with a translation module that turns standardized tests into context-sensitive formats for neurodivergent students, I added. And we just signed a multi-year contract with UNESCO to scale access across Francophone Africa. Dead silence. Julian barked out a short, incredulous laugh. "You're joking." I turned to him calmly. "Do I look like I'm joking?" He shook his head slowly. "You're saying that—" "What? You're a government contractor now?" "No," I replied. "I'm a problem solver. Government is just one of our clients." Aunt Pamela leaned forward, voice tentative. "But you're a non-profit, right? We're a hybrid," I explained. "Mission first with for-profit arms that license core tools to the private sector. All proceeds cycle back into the non-profit infrastructure. We operate lean intentionally." My mother blinked. "And you built all of this?" "Alone I had a team," I said, "but I founded it, funded it, and I still run it." My father looked stunned. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I smiled thinly. "Because no one ever asked. That landed harder than I expected." Several relatives shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact. Still, Julian said, folding his arms, "You must have used some Morgan contacts to get those contracts." I raised an eyebrow. "Actually, Morgan Industries tried to block our licensing in 2018. His smile faltered. What I looked around the room. "Your firm, Julian, filed a cease and desist, claiming our engagement analytics infringed on a patent you'd filed." The timing was convenient. Just as we were closing our first national contract. "That's," he began, but my father cut in. "Is that true?" Julian's jaw clenched. "It was a standard legal maneuver. We own dozens of IP claims. We protect them aggressively." "You tried to sink your sister's company," my father said flatly. Julian scoffed. "I didn't even know she was behind it. She never used the Morgan name." "That was the point," I said quietly. The room had shifted again, this time sharply, unmistakably. "You sued your own family," my mother said, horror dawning on her face. Julian turned defensive. "It wasn't personal. It was corporate. Besides, if her tech had merit, it would have survived." "It did," I said. "We won the arbitration, and that court ruling helped us secure funding from 3 major impact investors." My father leaned back, clearly processing. "You fought off a Morgan-backed legal team?" I nodded. "Alone, with Malcolm's legal advisor," I said. "And a lot of midnight ramen." A chuckle rose from someone, nervous, unsure, but it broke the tension. Aunt Cynthia muttered I had no idea. "No one did," I said, "because that's how you survive when you're building something that doesn't fit the mold. You stay quiet, you stay focused, and you let the results speak." Julian looked like he wanted to vanish. "You crushed a billion-dollar firm with pro bono counsel," my cousin whispered. "I didn't crush anyone," I said. "I just refused to be erased." The table sat with that. My father exhaled. "I'm beginning to think I backed the wrong child." My mother gasped. Julian looked like he'd been slapped. But I shook my head. "Don't say that. That's not the point." "Then what is?" he asked. I looked around. "That there's more than one way to carry a name, more than one way to create legacy. Mine just didn't need marble lobbies or press releases." He nodded, slowly, visibly moved. Melissa spoke next, her voice subdued. "And the students, what happens to them if the funding dries up? We've structured it to sustain itself," I said. "The private licensing arm covers the non-profit's operational core. We don't rely on philanthropy. We build ecosystems." She gave a small, surprised nod. Then my father raised his glass, not theatrically, not for show, but with something close to reverence. "To Elena," he said, "to building something no one else could see until now." The room lifted their glasses one by one. This time I lifted mine too. Julian didn't speak for a long moment after my father's toast.
His jaw flexed once, then again, like he was chewing a bitter pill. His usual armor confidence, polished to perfection, had fractured under the weight of something he couldn't quantify or compete with. Impact. My mother finally broke the silence, though her voice wavered. "Eleanor, dear, if I had known—" "But you didn't," I said gently, "because you didn't ask. None of you did."
She blinked, clearly unprepared for a direct answer. "We just assumed you were being private. That's a polite word for dismissed," I replied. There it was again, that raw truth I'd been swallowing for years, finally surfacing. I didn't say it to punish her, but to name the wound. Sometimes naming is the first step to healing. Julian cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control. "So what, you expect an apology because you managed to make something of yourself?" I looked at him and for once felt no anger, only clarity. "I don't expect anything," I said. "That's what makes this moment mine." He didn't respond. But his cheeks were tinged red, and the hand that held his wineglass trembled slightly. Then my father stood, slowly, deliberately. "Julian," he said, voice low and controlled, "you once told me legacy was measured in buildings, in markets, in headlines." Julian's eyes narrowed, and my father turned to me.
"But she's done something we never have, not with all our assets combined." He looked around the table, now letting his words resonate. "Elena created a legacy that can't be bulldozed or rebranded. A legacy that lives in people, not portfolios." My chest tightened. The words landed like a benediction I hadn't known I needed. He continued, turning back to Julian. "She fought for it, without the Morgan name, without our resources, and she did it without needing to crush others to rise." Julian opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no rebuttal. My father looked at me again. His gaze held something different now, not just recognition, but something closer to pride. "You've built something that will outlast towers," he said. "Something that changes lives long after you're gone. That's what I always wanted to do before I got distracted by margins and mergers." I didn't trust my voice yet, so I nodded. My mother's eyes filled, but whether with remorse or relief I couldn't tell. I spoke slowly, choosing each word carefully. "I didn't need you to validate me, but hearing this, it still matters." My father stepped closer. "You mattered long before this, Elena. I just didn't see you clearly." And with that, something cracked inside me, not in pain, but release. The knot I'd carried for years wound tight by every ignored email, every family function where I was. The punchline finally loosened. "I used to think," I said, voice soft, "that silence was strength, that staying small in your world kept the peace." I looked around the table at the faces that once judged me in whispers, and now watched me with something like reverence. But peace without truth is just surrender. And I stopped surrendering a long time ago. Several guests looked down at their plates, unsure where to put their eyes. Julian stood abruptly. "I need some air." No one stopped him. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was earned. My father turned to the rest of the table. "I think we owe Elena more than admiration. We owe her our respect, and maybe our support." He sat back down, and for the first time in my life, I saw him not as the CEO of the Morgan dynasty, but as a father trying. I placed my hand over the watch on my wrist, feeling its familiar weight. Malcolm would have said this wasn't vindication, it was transformation. He would have been right. The girl who walked into this room felt like a ghost. The woman who sat here now had come back to life. The room had changed. Suddenly I was no longer the outsider, the black sheep, the one with principles but no power. Instead, I was a centerpiece surrounded not by scorn but curiosity. "Elena," Aunt Pamela said, leaning forward like a guest at a gala, "do you have any room in that foundation of yours for a scholarship? I know a promising young artist who could use a hand." It took me a second to process her tone. Sweet. Almost reverent. "I'd be happy to review her portfolio," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Cousin Matthew piped up next. "I have a contact at Bloomberg who'd love to do a feature on Nova Bridge. Human impact angle.
I can make the call if you'd like. This from a man who once told me over brunch that tech for social good was career cosplay. Even my mother was smiling now, the kind of smile reserved for society columns and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Maybe we could host a fundraiser, she offered. Do it right here at the estate. Show our friends the good work you're doing. I nodded politely, heart ticking faster than the reed watch on my wrist. Then came Julian. He had returned from his air break looking composed, even casual.
Too casual. He walked over and extended a hand across the table. I owe you an apology, he said, voice smooth as poured cream. Truly, I was out of line and clearly underestimated what you've built. I stood slowly hesitating before taking his hand. Thank you, I said, uncertain of what else to offer. He held my grip a second too long. You're a force, Elena, he said with a small smile. We should talk. Maybe there's room for partnership, family synergy. Every word made my stomach turn. And yet, wasn't this what I wanted? To be heard, respected. Why then did it all feel like performance? As the evening wore on, I found myself trapped in a strange new orbit, one where admiration came laced with strategy, where every praise felt like a pitch. A cousin slipped me a card, just in case you're hiring. My godmother asked about naming rights for a classroom wing. Even the staff seemed to walk a little more attentively around me now, though Philip the butler gave me a look that said he hadn't changed his opinion one bit. I appreciated that. It wasn't until dessert, poached pears plated with edible gold, that I noticed something odd. Julian's phone, tucked beneath his napkin, was angled awkwardly. The screen was glowing faintly. I frowned. As he reached for his glass, I caught a better glimpse. He was recording. The camera app was open, the lens aimed across the table, and judging by the position, it had been active for a while. I sat back, my appetite gone. Excuse me, I said quietly, rising from the table. Outside the dining room, the hallway felt cooler, sharper. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady the adrenaline now spiking behind my ribs. He was filming us, filming me, for what brand? Rehab leverage. A promotional clip to show how progressive and unified the Morgan family had become. So much for reconciliation. A moment later I heard footsteps. Julian. He approached with that same controlled smile. Need some air too, I turned slowly. You're recording? He blinked. What, your phone? Under the napkin. The lens was aimed directly at the table. He chuckled as if I were a child making up stories. Come on, Elena, don't be paranoid. I crossed my arms. What were you planning to do with the footage? His smile dropped, just for a second, then returned. Just capturing a bit of family history. This is a moment, isn't it, your big reveal? My throat tightened. You didn't ask. I didn't think I needed to, he said. You want visibility, right? Impact exposure helps. I want consent, I snapped. And integrity, 2 things you still struggle with. He took a step back, hands raised. All right. I'll delete it. I want to see it deleted. He hesitated, then pulled out his phone, swiping with exaggerated motions until the video screen vanished. I didn't thank him. Because some things, when violated, don't deserve gratitude, only clarity. And I saw him now, more clearly than ever. I returned to the dining room with Julian a few steps behind me, his smile carefully reapplied, like a politician's mask. But something inside me had shifted. The table was still lively conversation, bubbling with newfound fascination for my impact story. Someone was quoting something I'd said earlier about metrics and meaning as if reciting scripture. Others chimed in with ideas for gala themes or awareness campaigns. And suddenly I saw it for what it was, not admiration, but hunger. A scramble to associate, to absorb my story into the Morgan mythology now that it had proven profitable. I took my seat in silence. My father watched me from across the table. Something in his expression had changed, not the reverent surprise from earlier, nor the quiet pride, but something deeper, sharper. He stood. The room hushed instinctively.
When Thomas Morgan rose at dinner, it usually meant a toast or a verdict. Everyone turned. "I've listened long enough," he said, voice clear and calm. "And I think it's time we clarify what this family stands for." Julian tensed visibly, eyes narrowing. My father looked around the table, slowly making eye contact with nearly every person present. For years he began, "We've measured success in units that shine, buildings, mergers, press releases, gala invitations. We've told ourselves that legacy is built in limestone and leverage." He paused. But tonight I was reminded that legacy is actually much quieter and far more difficult to earn. He turned toward me. "Eleanor didn't just build a company. She built something that sees the invisible values, the discarded, and amplifies those no one was listening to." My chest tightened. I could barely meet his eyes. She did it without our money, without our platform, and without ever using our name. He looked back at the table.
"And now that her work has been revealed, I see many of you eager to align, to participate, to reframe yourselves in its glow." A few murmurs rose, nervous, uncomfortable. "But let me be clear," he said. "Elena doesn't owe us proximity. We owe her humility." Julian scoffed quietly, but it was loud enough. My father turned sharply. "And you—" His voice dropped to something colder. "You filmed this evening without consent. You tried to use her moment as a way to rebrand this family." Julian's smile cracked. "This isn't the first time," my father continued, "that you've manipulated moments to benefit optics over integrity. I overlooked it for too long. That ends now." A stunned silence spread across the table like a shiver. My father raised his glass, not to me this time, but to the entire room. "Let me be very clear. Family is not defined by appearances. It's not curated, it's not filmed, filtered, or force-fed to the media." He turned his eyes on Julian again.
"Family is understanding, respect, the ability to sit in someone's truth without needing to spin it." Then softer now to me. And for too long Eleanor sat alone. No one moved. Even the servers paused in the corners of the room, sensing the shift. I felt something unclench in my ribs. Not vindication, not triumph, relief. Because finally, I wasn't defending myself. Someone else had stepped into the line of fire for me. And that, more than any recognition or applause, made me feel whole. My father sat back down slowly. I nodded once, my throat too tight to speak. Julian stood without a word and walked out again. This time, no one followed. My mother reached for her napkin fingers, trembling slightly. My aunts said nothing. My cousins looked unsure, but not unkind. And I sat still, watch ticking at my wrist, heart slow and full. Because the truth had finally spoken louder than the myth.
3 days after the dinner, I returned to the Nova Bridge office, our space on the 15th floor of a modest building in downtown Manhattan. No marble lobby, no valet, just wide windows, whiteboards filled with equations, and the hum of purpose. It was a Monday. Quiet, focused, exactly the way I liked it. I had a 10 a.m. mentorship interview, scheduled part of our new initiative to pair high school students with tech professionals on live social impact projects. The program was one of my favourites, not because it scaled fast, but because it was slow, personal, real. I scanned the candidate's file again, Jada Morales. 17, senior at East Bronx Charter, GPA 3.9, interests civic data, education, equity, behavioural analytics. Her application essay had been raw, sharp, and beautifully unfinished, just like the kids we hoped to reach. At 9:58 she arrived, small-framed, hair in a puff, eyes bright but guarded. "Hi," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "I'm Jada. Thanks for having me." I smiled. "Of course. Come in. Sit wherever you feel comfortable." She chose the edge of the long meeting table, carefully placing her tote bag in her lap. We talked, for over an hour, about dropout predictors, transportation deserts, lunch debt algorithms. She had mapped out an early prototype on paper, literal graph paper.
Her vision was simple, a tool that helped teachers flag silent dropouts, kids still showing up physically, but mentally slipping away. I was floored. I've never met someone your age talk this fluently about social modelling, I said. She shrugged, a bit shy now. I've seen too many smart kids disappear before senior year. 1 week they're here, the next they're gone. No one sees the patterns. I want to. I sat back feeling the familiar mix of admiration and ache. We wrapped up, and I was ready to offer her the spot on the mentorship track when she reached into her bag. "My grandma asked me to give you this," she said, pulling out a small yellowed envelope. I blinked. "Your grandma?" "She used to work for your family. A long time ago. Said if I ever met you, I should say thank you." I frowned, confused. Took the envelope. Inside was a faded photo. A woman in her 30s, wearing a navy uniform, standing next to a much younger version of me in pigtails. I remembered that uniform. "Anna," I whispered. Jada smiled. "My Nana." The memory struck hard. Anna, our housekeeper who braided my hair before school, snuck me tamarind candy, hummed lullabies when my mother forgot bedtime. She had vanished suddenly one summer. I was told she moved, but I never saw her again. "Julian had her fired," Jada said gently, after she caught him yelling at one of the landscapers. He said she overstepped. My throat went dry. "I never knew what happened to her," I said. "She knew what happened to you," Jada replied. "She read about Nova Bridge. She kept a file on your work, clipped articles. Said she wasn't surprised you always noticed the quiet people in the room." I pressed the photo to my chest, eyes stinging. "She passed away last year," Jada added softly. "But she told me, if you ever sit in front of Eleanor Morgan, don't waste the moment. Show her you're worth betting on." I exhaled shakily. "You already have," I said. "Welcome to the team." Jada beamed a rare, full smile. She would have loved to hear that. I nodded, heart too full for more words. In that moment, it wasn't about redemption. It wasn't about family reputation or private dinners or vintage watches. It was about circles closing, about carrying something forward, not for image, but for impact. 2 weeks later, the Reed Legacy Fellowship launched from the main hall of the Morgan Foundation, a building that had once hosted hedge fund galas and museum benefits, now filled with folding chairs, school banners, and 17-year-olds in oversized blazers. My father stood beside me at the podium. It still felt strange. He wasn't there for press or politics. He wasn't trying to impress board members or balance the optics of wealth. He was simply present, quietly proud. We called it the Reed Fellowship because calling it Morgan would have missed the point. It wasn't about lineage, it was about light passing it forward without taking credit for where it came from. The program would fund full tuition scholarships for students like Jada, pairing them with tech mentors across sectors, education, civic planning, healthcare, where they'd apply data not just to build things, but to fix them. At the reception, my father worked the room with the grace of an old-school businessman and the quiet urgency of a new convert. He listened to students, took notes, asked questions. At one point, I caught him offering his direct line to a junior coder from Newark. The boy nearly fainted. We were rewriting something, he and I, not just the narrative of our relationship, but the entire arc of what it meant to bear a family name. One of the reporters asked for a photo. I declined. My father nodded in agreement. Some things don't need a headline. 2 days later, the board of the Morgan Family Council convened. It was mostly symbolic, an internal governance group that advised on legacy projects and charitable giving. But for decades, Julian had used it as his personal platform, curating initiatives, freezing out dissenters, shaping the family brand. Until now. My father opened the meeting with a motion that Julian be removed from his position on the council pending an ethics review. No theatrics, just clear documentation, unauthorized recordings, misrepresentation of family partnerships, and an ongoing history of coercive behavior masked as leadership. No one defended him. Julian wasn't even there. He'd taken a sabbatical. The motion passed. It wasn't revenge. It was redirection.
Later that night, my father and I sat alone in the rooftop greenhouse he'd converted from an old terrace. Plants surrounded us, tomatoes, mint, lavender, things he now preferred over leather chairs and skyline views. I used to think legacy was what people remembered about you after you were gone, he said, staring at a pot of basil. But now I think it's what people carry because of you, while you're still alive. I said nothing, just listened. You've given them something, he said. These kids, these educators. Something I never did, not even with 100 buildings. You built things too, I said gently. He shook his head. But I never gave away my name for the sake of something better. You did. I looked down at my wrist. The watch was still there. Of course it was. It had never been about its worth. Only its weight. And I carried it now, not as a symbol of rebellion, but as inheritance. Not from the family I was born into, but from the man who saw me before anyone else did. Do you miss him? My father asked. Every day. He nodded. I wish I'd known him better. You still can, I said. Through what we build next. He smiled softly. Then let's keep building. We sat in silence as the city lights blinked below, and for once I didn't feel the need to say more. Later, alone in my apartment, I placed the watch on my nightstand and stared at it for a long time. Not because I doubted who I was, but because I no longer needed anyone else to confirm it. I thought of the dinner, the dismissals, the laughter, the silence, and then the shift. Not in their eyes, but in mine. I had arrived at that table unsure of my place. I left it knowing I had never needed one. Because some stories aren't about belonging, they're about becoming. And once you become, the need to be seen fades. What remains is what you give. What remains is who you lift. What remains is how you carry the weight, quietly, steadily, without apology. And when you do, the value of that weight speaks for itself. No permission needed.